The cause as well as the effect of such objective dependencies, where the subject as such remains free, rests upon the interchangeability of persons, the change of human subjects, voluntarily or affected by the structure of the relationship, discloses that indifference to subjective elements of dependence that characterizes the experience of freedom. I recall the experience referred to at the beginning of this chapter, namely that a change in obligations is often experienced as freedom. It is the same form of relationship between obligations and freedom that continues here only in the individual obligation. A simple example is the characteristic difference between a medieval vassal and a serf. The vassal could change his master whereas the serf was unalterably tied to the same one. This reflects an incomparably higher measure of independence for the vassal compared with the serf, even though their obligations, considered by themselves, would have been the same. It is not the bond as such, but being bound to a particular individual master that represents the real antipode of freedom. Even the modern status of domestic servants is characterized by the fact that employers can choose by references and personal recommendations, whereas the servant has neither the chance nor the criteria for making similar choices. Only in most recent times has the scarcity of domestic servants in large cities occasionally provided the possibility of turning down a position for imponderable reasons. Both sides consider this a major step towards the independence of servants, even though the actual demands of the job are no less heavy than they previously were. If we consider the same form of relationship in an altogether different area, we can say that if an Anabaptist sect justifies polygamy and the frequent change of wives on the grounds that this destroys the inner dependency or the female role, then this is merely the caricature of a basically sound observation. Our overall condition is at any moment composed of both a measure of obligation and a measure of freedom, such that, within a specific sphere of life, the one is to a greater extent realized in its content, the other in its form. The restraints imposed upon us by a specific interest are felt to be less oppressive if we can choose for ourselves the objective, ideal or personal authorities to whom we are obliged without reducing the degree of dependence. A formally similar development emerges for wage laborers in a money economy. In view of the harshness and coerced nature of labor, it seems as if the wage laborer is nothing but a disguised slave. We shall see later how the fact that they are slaves of the objective process of production may be interpreted as a transitional stage towards their emancipation. From the subjective aspect, however, the relationship to the individual employer has become much more loose compared with earlier forms of labor. Certainly the worker is tied to his job almost as the peasant to his lot, but the frequency with which employers change in a money economy and the frequent possibility of choosing and changing them that is made possible by the form of money wages provide an altogether new freedom within the framework of his dependency. The slave could not change his master even if he had been willing to risk much worse living conditions, whereas the industrial worker can do that at any time. By thus eliminating the pressure of irrevocable dependency upon a particular individual master, the worker is already on the way to personal freedom despite his objective bondage. That this emergent freedom has little continuous influence upon the material situation of the worker should not prevent us from appreciating it. For here, as in other spheres, there is no necessary connection between liberty and increased well-being which is usually automatically presupposed by wishes, theories and agitations. The absence of such a connection is largely the result of the fact that the freedom of the worker is matched by the freedom of the employer, which did not exist in a society of bonded labor. The slave owner as well as the lord of the manor had a personal interest in keeping his slaves and his serfs in a good and efficient condition. His authority over them entailed his obligation to them in his own interest. Either this is not the case for the capitalist in relation to the wage laborer or, wherever it may be so, it is usually not realized. The emancipation of the laborer has to be paid for, as it were, by the emancipation of the employer, that is, by the loss of welfare that the bonded laborer enjoyed. The harshness or insecurity of his present condition is very much an indication of the process of emancipation which begins with the elimination of individually determined dependence. Freedom in a social sense, like lack of freedom, is a relationship between human beings. Its growth implies that the relationship changes from one of stability and invariability to one of liability and interchangeability of persons. Since freedom means independence from the will of others, it commences with independence from the will of specific individuals. The lonely settler in the German or American forests is non-dependent. The inhabitants of a modern metropolis are independent in the positive sense of the word, and even though they require innumerable suppliers, workers, and cooperators and would be lost without them, their relationship to them is completely objective and is only embodied in money. Thus the city dweller is not dependent upon any of them as particular individuals but only upon their objective services which have a money value and may therefore be carried out by any interchangeable person. In that the purely money relationship ties the individual very closely to the group as an abstract whole, and in that this is because money, in the light of our earlier deliberations, is the representative of abstract group forces, the relationship of individual persons to others simply duplicates the relationship that they have to objects as a result of money. By means of the rapid increase in the supply of commodities, on the one hand, and through the peculiar devaluation and loss of quality that objects undergo in a money economy on the other, the individual object becomes irrelevant, often almost worthless. In contrast, not only does the whole class of these objects retain its significance, but as that culture develops our dependency on these and a steadily increasing number of objects grows, one particular pen is just as good or as worthless as any other, but the modern civilized individual could not manage without pens. Finally, the significance of money develops according to this very same tendency. The enormous cheapening of money makes specific amounts of money increasingly less valuable and important, while the role of money as a whole becomes more and more powerful and comprehensive. Within the money economy, as these phenomena illustrate, the specificity and individuality of objects becomes more and more indifferent, insubstantial, and interchangeable to us, while the actual function of the whole class of objects becomes more important and makes us increasingly dependent upon it. This development is part of a much more general pattern which is valid for an extraordinary number of aspects and relationships of human life. These usually have their origin in an integral unity of the material and the personal. This does not mean, as it appears to us today, that the contents of life such as property and work, duty and knowledge, social position and religion possessed some kind of independent existence, a real or conceptual independence, and that they entered any close and solidaristic union only after they had been taken up by the personality. Rather, the primary state is a complete unity, an unbroken indifference which is completely removed from the opposition of the personal and objective sides of life. At lower levels of human development, for example, imagination is as yet unable to distinguish between objective, logical truth and subjective, psychological formations. Both the child and primitive man immediately conceive of the psychological forms of the transitory moment, the fantasy, and the subjective impression as reality. The word and the object, the symbol and what it represents, the name and the person are identical, as has been shown by innumerable ethnological findings and by child psychology. This process does not derive from the fact that two separate series mistakenly converge and become confused. Rather, a duality does not yet exist at all, either abstractly or in any concrete manifestation. The notional contents appear from the outset as a completely undivided whole whose unity does not lie in the dissolution of opposites but in their being passed over in silence. Thus, the contents of life as mentioned above develop immediately in a personal form. The emphasis on the ego on the one hand, and the object on the other, evolves from the originally naive unified form as the result of a long, never-ending process of differentiation. The way in which the personality grows out of the state of indifference to the contents of life, the way in which, from the other side, the objectivity of things evolves, is at the same time the process of the emergence of freedom. What we term freedom has such a close relationship to the principle of personality that moral philosophy frequently proclaims both terms to be identical. That unity of psychic elements, their tendency to convergence in one center, that fixed distinctness and uniqueness of the entity that we term personality actually means independence from and exclusion of all extraneous factors, and development exclusively according to the laws of one's own being which we call freedom. Both concepts of freedom and personality contain, in an equal measure, emphasis upon an ultimate and fundamental